The sound of hunger gnawed at Victoria Kingston's stomach as she stood before the dusty window of Thompson's General Store in Idaho City, Idaho Territory, clutching the only thing of value she had left in this world. The gold wedding band on her finger felt heavier than it ever had when Thomas was alive, and the thought of parting with it made her throat tighten with a grief that hadn't lessened in the 6 months since they'd buried him. But her 2 children, Martha and Samuel, hadn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford in the autumn of 1873. The store smelled of tobacco, leather, and coffee beans when she pushed through the door. Mr. Thompson looked up from his ledger, his weathered face registering the kind of pity that made Victoria's cheeks burn. She was only 24 years old, but felt ancient as she approached the counter, her worn calico dress hanging loose on a frame that had grown thin from giving most of her food to her children. "Mrs. Kingston," Thompson said, setting down his pencil. His tone was gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I need flour, bacon, and whatever else this will buy," Victoria said, her voice barely above a whisper as she twisted the ring from her finger. The metal scraped against her knuckle, resistant to leaving after 5 years of marriage. When it finally came free, she placed it on the wooden counter between them, the small band gleaming dully in the afternoon light streaming through the window. Thompson picked up the ring, examining it with a practiced eye. "This is good gold, madam, worth more than a few groceries." "Then I'll take what I need now, and you can hold credit for me," Victoria said, lifting her chin despite the shame coursing through her veins. "My children need to eat." The storekeeper nodded slowly, pulling out a small cloth bag from beneath the counter. He dropped the ring inside and tied it with string. "I'll give you fair value, Mrs. Kingston. You have my word." 20 minutes later, Victoria walked out of the store with a burlap sack of provisions, her left hand feeling naked and wrong without the familiar weight of her wedding band. The September wind kicked up dust along the main street, and she blinked against the grit, telling herself that was why her eyes watered. She'd made it halfway to her small cabin on the edge of town when she heard boots on the boardwalk behind her. "Madam, you dropped something," a deep voice called out. Victoria turned to see a tall man striding toward her, his broad shoulders blocking out the sun. He wore the dust-covered clothes of a ranch hand, dark pants and a faded blue shirt, with a well-worn hat tipped low over his eyes. When he got closer, she could make out strong features bronzed by years in the sun, and eyes the color of sage that held unexpected kindness. "I didn't drop anything," she said, confused, shifting the heavy sack in her arms. The man stopped a respectful distance away, removing his hat to reveal dark brown hair that needed cutting. "Forgive me, madam. I shouldn't have startled you. My name's Robert Garrison, and I just came from Thompson's store. He mentioned you might need some help carrying your supplies." Victoria's spine stiffened. "I don't need charity, Mr. Garrison." "Didn't figure you did," Robert said easily, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who'd spent time in Texas. "But those supplies look heavy, and I was heading this direction anyway." Seemed the neighborly thing to offer. There was something in his steady gaze that wasn't pity, just simple human decency, and Victoria felt her defenses waver. The sack was heavy, and she still had another half-mile to walk. "I live at the edge of town," she said finally. "The small cabin past the church." "I know it," Robert said, falling into step beside her but not attempting to take her burden. They walked in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "I'm sorry about your husband. Thomas Kingston was a good man." Victoria's step faltered. "You knew Thomas." "We worked the same cattle drive 2 summers back before he settled here with you. He talked about his wife and babies the whole drive north, made the rest of us jealous." A hint of a smile touched Robert's mouth. He was proud of his family. The unexpected connection to her late husband loosened something in Victoria's chest, and she found herself blinking back genuine tears now. "Thank you for telling me that." They reached her cabin as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. The small structure needed repairs Victoria couldn't afford, with gaps in the chinking and a roof that leaked when it rained hard. But it was home, and through the single window she could see Martha, who was 7, watching over 4-year-old Samuel while they played with carved wooden animals Thomas had made. "This is me," Victoria said, stopping at the gate of the small fence Thomas had built their first year in Idaho City. Robert's gaze took in the property, and she saw him note the sagging porch step, the missing shingles, the general air of neglect that came from a widow trying to survive alone. But he didn't comment, just tipped his hat again. "It was nice meeting you, Mrs. Kingston. If you ever need anything, I'm working at the Reynolds Ranch, about 3 miles north of town." Victoria nodded, clutching her sack of provisions. "Thank you for walking with me." She watched him stride back toward town, his long legs eating up the distance, before she went inside to feed her hungry children. That night, as she ladled thin soup into bowls, she kept touching her bare finger, the absence of her ring a constant reminder of how far she'd fallen. But her children ate, and that was what mattered. What Victoria didn't know was that Robert Garrison had gone directly back to Thompson's general store before it closed. The storekeeper was just locking up when Robert knocked on the door. "We're closed," Thompson called through the glass. "I need to make a purchase," Robert said. "It's important." Thompson unlocked the door, curiosity evident on his face. "What's so urgent it can't wait until morning?" "That ring you took from Mrs. Kingston, I want to buy it." The storekeeper's eyebrows rose. "That's an unusual request." Robert pulled out a worn leather wallet from his back pocket, extracting bills he'd saved from 3 months of wages. "How much?" Thompson named a price that was fair, perhaps even generous. Robert counted out the money without hesitation, though it took nearly everything he had. The storekeeper retrieved the small cloth bag and handed it over, his expression thoughtful. "You planning to court the widow Kingston?" Thompson asked. "I'm planning to return something that shouldn't have been sold in the first place," Robert said, pocketing the ring. "What happens after that is up to God and the lady herself." But returning the ring proved more complicated than buying it. Robert quickly realized he couldn't just show up at Victoria's cabin and hand her the ring without embarrassing her or making her feel like an object of charity. He needed time to know her, to court her properly, to make it clear his intentions were honorable and had nothing to do with pity. So he started finding reasons to be in town more often. The Reynolds Ranch kept him busy, but his boss, an understanding man named William Reynolds, didn't object when Robert volunteered for errands that took him through Idaho City. And somehow, those errands often coincided with times when Victoria might be at the mercantile, or the church, or walking her children to the small schoolhouse. Their second meeting happened 3 days after their first, when Robert encountered Victoria struggling with a broken wagon wheel outside Thompson's store. Her small cart had tipped, spilling potatoes into the dirt street, and she was trying to right it while keeping Samuel from running into the road. "Mrs. Kingston, let me help," Robert said, swinging down from his horse and handing the reins to young Samuel. "Can you hold this for me, son?" Samuel's eyes went wide with excitement at being trusted with the large animal, and he gripped the reins with both small hands. Robert lifted the cart with ease, examining the cracked wheel. "This needs replacing," he said. "You've got a split in the hub." Victoria's face fell. "I can't afford a new wheel right now." "I can fix it well enough to get you home," Robert said, already pulling tools from his saddlebag. "It won't last forever, but it'll hold for a few weeks." As he worked, Victoria gathered the scattered potatoes, and Martha helped her mother while keeping a protective eye on her little brother. Robert found himself stealing glances at Victoria, noting the way she moved with efficient grace despite her worn clothing, the way she spoke gently to her children, the strength in her shoulders despite everything she carried. "Where did you learn to fix wheels?" Victoria asked, kneeling beside him as he bound the split hub with wire. "My father was a wheelwright in Texas before he died," Robert said, not looking up from his work. "Taught me his trade before I took to ranching." "You're from Texas?" "Yes, madam, near Austin. Came north after the war, looking for work and a fresh start." He tightened the wire, testing the wheel's strength. "Lost my whole family to fever in '68. Seemed like staying in Texas would mean living in a graveyard of memories." Victoria was quiet for a moment, and when he glanced at her, he saw understanding in her dark eyes. "I know something about wanting to escape memories," she said softly. Robert finished his repair and stood, brushing dust from his knees. "This should hold, but you'll need a proper replacement soon." "Thank you," Victoria said, and this time when she met his eyes, there was something more than gratitude there, a flicker of connection that made Robert's heart beat faster. He started finding more reasons to help after that. When the autumn rains came and Victoria's roof began leaking in earnest, Robert showed up one Sunday morning with shingles and tar paper, claiming he'd over-ordered for the Reynolds Ranch and would just have to throw away the extra if someone didn't use it. Victoria protested, but Martha was already coughing from sleeping in damp conditions, and pride had to give way to practicality. Robert worked through the afternoon, replacing rotted shingles while Victoria made him lunch from her meager supplies. When he climbed down from the roof at sunset, she had a plate of beans and cornbread waiting, and he sat on her newly repaired porch step to eat it. "You can't keep doing this," Victoria said, sitting beside him while her children played in the yard. "I can't pay you, and it isn't right to take so much help without offering something in return." "You made me lunch," Robert pointed out, scraping his plate clean. "And if you want to talk about what's right, it isn't right for a good woman and her children to suffer when folks can help." "People will talk," Victoria said quietly. "A widow and a single man spending time together before a proper mourning period has passed." Robert set down his plate and turned to look at her directly. The evening light caught in her dark hair, escaped from its pins during the day's work, and he thought she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, even worn down by grief and hardship. "Let them talk," he said. "I'm not going to let you drown because someone might whisper about propriety. Your husband's been gone 6 months, and this isn't Boston society. This is Idaho territory, where survival matters more than scandal." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I miss him so much," she whispered. "Some days I can barely breathe for missing him. And then I feel guilty because I'm so tired of struggling alone. And sometimes I wonder if I'm going to make it through the winter, and that makes me feel like I'm betraying his memory by not being stronger." Without thinking, Robert reached out and took her hand, the one without the ring, and held it gently. "You're the strongest person I've met," he said. "And Thomas would want you to survive. He'd want his children cared for. There's no betrayal in accepting help or in eventually finding joy again." Victoria looked down at their joined hands, and Robert worried he'd overstepped until she squeezed his fingers gently before pulling away. "Thank you," she said. "For the roof, for the kind words, for everything." As the weeks passed and October gave way to November, Robert became a regular presence in Victoria's life. He brought supplies, claiming the ranch had ordered too much or that he'd won them in a card game. He fixed her fence, her porch, her squeaking door hinges. He carved new toys for Samuel and Martha, whittling in the evenings while Victoria mended clothes by lamplight. And slowly, so slowly that Victoria almost didn't notice it happening, her grief began to make room for something else. She found herself watching for Robert on the days he usually came to town, her heart lifting when she spotted him riding down the street. She laughed at his stories about ranch life, the first real laughter she'd experienced since Thomas died. She caught herself taking extra care with her hair on mornings she thought she might see him. The guilt came with the growing affection, waves of it that made her stomach clench. She'd loved Thomas with her whole heart, and part of her felt like caring for Robert was a betrayal of that love. But another part, the part that was still a young woman with a future ahead of her, whispered that Thomas was gone and she was still alive. And being alive meant eventually finding reasons to keep living beyond just surviving. Robert felt the shift between them too, the way conversations lingered longer, the way their eyes met and held across her small kitchen table, the way accidental touches sent warmth through his whole body. The ring in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the leather, but he forced himself to be patient. Victoria needed time, and he needed to be certain that what they felt was real and not just the product of her desperation and his desire to rescue her. Winter arrived early that year, with November bringing snow that dusted the mountains and made the nights bitter cold. Robert worried about Victoria's drafty cabin, about whether she had enough firewood, enough warm clothes for the children. His concern drove him to take a risk that might push her away, but could save her life. He approached her on a Friday afternoon at Thompson's store, where she was carefully counting coins to buy coffee. The sight of her calculating every penny, her thin face tight with concentration, made his decision easier. "Mrs. Kingston, could I speak with you privately?" he asked, keeping his voice low. Victoria looked up, surprised, then nodded. They stepped outside into the cold afternoon, and Robert pulled her aside where they wouldn't be overheard. "I know you value your independence," he began, his breath fogging in the cold air, "and I respect that. But winter's coming hard, and your cabin isn't prepared for the kind of cold we get up here in the mountains." Victoria's expression closed off. "We'll manage." "I'm sure you'll try," Robert said gently, "but Martha's already getting sick from the damp and it's only going to get worse. I've been thinking about this and I have a proposal. Not a marriage proposal," he added quickly, seeing alarm flash across her face. "A business arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Robert had rehearsed this speech a dozen times, but now that the moment was here, the words tangled on his tongue. "The Reynolds Ranch has a foreman's cottage that's sitting empty. It's small but solid, with a good stove and tight walls. Mrs. Reynolds mentioned they're looking for someone to help with cooking and laundry, especially with their regular housekeeper getting too old for the heavy work. The job comes with the cottage, meals, and wages." Victoria stared at him. "You're offering me a job." "I'm telling you about a job that exists," Robert corrected. "What you do with that information is your choice. But yes, I mentioned to Mrs. Reynolds that I knew a hard-working widow who might be interested. She's hoping you'll come talk to her." "Robert," Victoria said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name, making his heart skip. "Did you create this job for me?" He met her eyes steadily. "No, the Reynolds genuinely need help and they've been talking about hiring someone for months. Did I suggest you specifically?" "Yes." "Does that make it charity?" "I don't think so. You'd be earning your keep and then some. Mrs. Reynolds is particular about her household and she wouldn't hire someone just to do me a favor." Victoria wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. "People would really talk then." "Me living on the same ranch where you work?" "It's a big ranch," Robert said. And you'd be living in the main house area while I'm in the bunkhouse with the other hands. It's more proper than me coming to your cabin all the time if you think about it." He could see her wavering, practical concerns warring with pride. "Think about Martha and Samuel," he pressed gently. "They need a warm place to live, regular meals, a safe place to grow up. You can give them that and still maintain your independence." Victoria closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, he saw resignation mixed with relief. "When does Mrs. Reynolds want to meet me?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing." The next day, Robert drove Victoria and her children out to the Reynolds ranch in a borrowed wagon. The main house was a sprawling structure of wood and stone, impressive by Idaho Territory standards, and Victoria's nervousness showed in the way she smoothed her best dress and checked her children's appearance 3 times before knocking on the door. Martha Reynolds was a practical woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that reminded Robert of a general inspecting troops. But she was also fair and kind, and she took to Victoria immediately, appreciating her honest answers and the respectful way her children behaved. "My last housekeeper is 72 and can't handle the heavy work anymore," Mrs. Reynolds explained, leading Victoria through the spacious kitchen. "I need someone who can help with cooking for the ranch hands, laundry, cleaning, and general household management. It's hard work, and the hours can be long during busy seasons." "I'm not afraid of hard work, madam," Victoria said quietly. "I can see that." Mrs. Reynolds studied her shrewdly. "You've got the look of someone who's been through trials and came out stronger. That's what I need, not some delicate flower who'll faint at the sight of dirty laundry. The cottage comes with the job, plus $40 a month in meals. You can take your breakfast and supper with us, and I'll make sure there's plenty for your children." $40 a month was more than Victoria had dared hope for. It was enough to start saving, to buy the children proper winter clothes, to stop living on the edge of desperation. "When would you want me to start? How about Monday? That'll give you time to pack up your things." "Robert can help you move," Mrs. Reynolds said, and there was a knowing glint in her eye that made Victoria blush. "And before you worry, I don't pay attention to idle gossip. You'll be working for me and living in my cottage, and anyone who wants to make something improper out of that can take it up with my husband's rifle." Despite her nervousness, Victoria laughed. She accepted the job, and true to Mrs. Reynolds' word, Robert helped her move that Monday. The foreman's cottage was a small 2-room structure with real glass windows, a cast iron stove that radiated blessed heat, and furniture that wasn't falling apart. For the first time in months, Victoria felt like she could breathe. Her work at the ranch was demanding but satisfying. She proved herself quickly, managing the household with efficiency and grace, cooking meals that had the ranch hands asking for seconds, and tackling mountains of laundry without complaint. Martha and Samuel thrived with regular meals and a warm place to sleep, their cheeks filling out and color returning to their faces. And Robert was there, not hovering or intrusive, but present in a way that felt natural. He'd stop by the kitchen for coffee and conversation, play with Samuel in the evenings, help Martha with her schoolwork. He made Victoria laugh with stories about stubborn cattle and ranch mishaps, and she found herself sharing stories about her life before Thomas died, remembering the good times instead of just mourning the loss. December arrived with heavy snow, and the ranch settled into winter routines. The work was harder in some ways, with frozen water to deal with and extra cooking to keep the hands fed, but Victoria had never been happier. She was warm, fed, earning her own way, and every day she spent near Robert made her more certain of her feelings. Robert, for his part, was falling deeper in love with every passing day. He loved Victoria's strength, her fierce protection of her children, her quiet dignity in the face of hardship. He loved the way she hummed while cooking, the rare smile that transformed her face, the intelligence in her dark eyes. The ring in his pocket became less about returning a lost possession and more about offering a future. But he still hesitated, afraid of moving too fast and scaring her away. The moment that changed everything came 3 days before Christmas. The ranch was preparing for the holiday, and Mrs. Reynolds had given Victoria extra money to buy presents for Martha and Samuel. Robert offered to drive her into Idaho City for shopping, and they made a day of it, browsing the mercantile while the children pressed their noses against the glass of the candy counter. "Pick something," Robert told Samuel and Martha, pressing a coin into each small hand. "It's Christmas." Their delighted faces as they carefully selected peppermint sticks made Victoria's eyes sting with grateful tears. She stepped outside to compose herself, and Robert followed, leaving the children to their important decision-making. "You're too generous," Victoria said, wiping her eyes. "You're always too generous with us." "I'm not generous enough," Robert said quietly. They stood in the afternoon snow, the street quiet around them, and he knew he couldn't wait any longer. "Victoria, I need to tell you something. That first day when I met you, after you'd been to Thompson's store." "I remember," she said softly. "I went back that evening and bought something from Mr. Thompson." Robert reached into his pocket, pulling out the small cloth bag he'd carried for 3 months. "I've been waiting for the right time to give this back to you, but I'm starting to think there's no perfect moment. There's just truth and honesty and hoping for the best." He opened the bag and Victoria's wedding ring fell into his palm. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You bought my ring." "That same day," Robert confirmed. "I couldn't stand the thought of you losing it, of it ending up on some stranger's hand when it meant so much to you. I bought it planning to return it, but then I got to know you and I fell in love with you, and suddenly it became less about returning the past and more about offering a future." Victoria stared at the ring, tears streaming down her face now. "You've had it all this time." "All this time," Robert agreed. "And I know it's too soon by society's standards. I know you're still grieving Thomas, and you probably always will in some ways. But I love you, Victoria. I love your strength and your courage and your fierce mother's heart. I love the way you laugh at my bad jokes and the way you sing to your children. I love everything about you, and I want to spend my life making sure you never have to sell anything precious again." He held out the ring. "This belonged to your first love, and I'm not trying to replace that or erase it. Thomas was a good man, and he gave you beautiful children and years of happiness. But he's gone, and I'm here, and I'm asking if you'll let me love you, not to replace what you lost, but to build something new." Victoria took the ring with shaking hands, holding it up to the winter light. It gleamed gold and precious, a piece of her past restored. Then she looked at Robert, really looked at him, seeing the hope and fear and love in his sage-colored eyes. "I feel so guilty," she whispered. "I loved Thomas with everything I had, I know. And I'm falling in love with you, and it feels like betrayal." "It's not," Robert said firmly. "Love isn't finite, Victoria. Your heart loving me doesn't mean it loved Thomas less. It just means you're alive and capable of building a new life." "What if I'm not ready?" "Then I'll wait," Robert said simply. "I've waited 3 months already. I can wait longer if that's what you need. But I wanted you to have this ring back either way, whether you choose me or not. It's yours, part of your history, and you shouldn't have lost it because you were hungry." Victoria closed her hand around the ring, feeling its familiar weight. Then she did something that surprised both of them. Instead of putting it back on her left hand, she slipped it onto her right hand, onto her 4th finger where it sat strange but somehow right. I'm not ready to take it off completely, she said, meeting Robert's eyes. Thomas deserves to be remembered, and this ring represents real love and real commitment. But I'm also not ready to keep wearing it as a wedding ring because you're right. I'm alive, and I'm falling in love again, and that's not betrayal. It's survival and hope and choosing to keep living. She stepped closer to Robert, close enough that he could see the snowflakes caught in her dark hair. I love you, she said, and the words rang clear and true in the winter air. I didn't want to, and I fought it, and I felt guilty about it. But I love you, Robert Garrison, and I want to build a future with you. Not tomorrow, maybe not even next month, but eventually, when both of us are ready. Robert's face broke into a smile that transformed his usually serious expression. Eventually sounds perfect to me. He wanted to kiss her more than he'd ever wanted anything, but they were on a public street and Victoria was still navigating the complicated waters of loving again after loss. So instead, he took her hand, the one with Thomas's ring on the right finger instead of the left, and squeezed it gently. Can I court you properly? He asked. Call on you officially, let everyone know my intentions are honorable. Yes, Victoria said, and she was smiling now too, the kind of smile that reached her eyes. You can court me properly, Robert Garrison. Though I should warn you, I come with 2 children and a stubborn, independent streak. I know, Robert said. That's part of why I love you. They went back inside to collect Martha and Samuel, who were sticky with peppermint and happiness, and drove back to the ranch as the sun set over the snow-covered mountains. That night, Victoria sat in her small cottage and looked at the ring on her right hand, feeling Thomas's memory settling into something softer than acute grief, something more like bittersweet gratitude for the time they'd had. Word spread quickly through the ranch and town that Robert Garrison was courting widow Kingston, and while some people whispered about the impropriety of it all, most folks were supportive. Victoria had earned respect through her hard work and dignity, and Robert was well liked among the ranch hands and townspeople. Mrs. Reynolds actively encouraged the courtship, pleased to see 2 good people finding happiness together. Robert courted Victoria through the winter months with a patience and thoughtfulness that made her love him more with each passing day. He brought her small gifts, not extravagant things she couldn't accept, but thoughtful tokens like a new book to read, ribbons for Martha's hair, a wooden horse he'd carved for Samuel. He sat with her in the evenings after the children were asleep, talking about everything and nothing, sharing their pasts and dreams for the future. He also made it clear he understood and respected Thomas's memory. When Victoria spoke about her late husband, Robert listened without jealousy, understanding that her past was part of what made her who she was. He encouraged her to share stories with the children about their father, to keep Thomas alive in their memories even as they built new ones. January brought bitter cold and heavy snow that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Robert worried constantly about Victoria and the children, checking on them multiple times a day until Victoria finally laughed and told him she'd survived worse than a Montana winter. They were in Idaho Territory, she reminded him, not the Arctic. Idaho Territory winter is bad enough, Robert grumbled, stomping snow off his boots in her cottage doorway. You've got enough firewood? You brought me enough firewood to last until summer, Victoria said, amused. Robert, you need to stop worrying so much. Can't help it, he admitted, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. I spent too many years alone, not having anyone to worry about. Now I've got you and the children, and all I can think about is making sure you're safe and warm and happy. Victoria set down her own cup and crossed to where he stood by the stove. She'd grown bolder in the weeks since their understanding, more comfortable with physical affection, and she rested her hand on his chest, feeling his heart beat strong beneath her palm. "We're safe," she said softly. "We're warm, we're fed, we're happy. You did that, Robert. You saved us." "You saved yourselves," Robert corrected, covering her hand with his. "I just helped a little." "You did more than help a little, and you know it." Victoria looked up at him, seeing the love in his eyes, feeling her own heart swell with matching emotion. "I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "Ready for more than courtship," Victoria said. "Ready to talk about the future seriously, about marriage and building a life together. I know it's only been a few months since Thomas died, and people will talk, but I don't care anymore. I love you, and I want to marry you, and I don't want to wait another year just to satisfy social conventions that don't matter anyway." Robert's hands came up to cup her face, his calloused thumbs brushing her cheekbones. "Are you sure? I don't want you to rush into anything you're not ready for." "I'm sure," Victoria said. "Thomas was my past, and I'll always love his memory. But you're my future, and I want that future to start now." This time when Robert kissed her, it wasn't the chaste pecks they'd shared before, but a real kiss full of promise and passion and hope. Victoria melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt truly alive instead of just surviving. They married in March, when the worst of winter had passed, and spring was starting to tease the mountains with warmer days. It was a small ceremony at the Idaho City church, attended by the Reynolds family, ranch hands, townspeople, and Victoria's children. Martha and Samuel, who'd grown to love Robert over the winter months, stood beside their mother with proud faces. The night before the wedding, Victoria did something both painful and necessary. She took Thomas's ring off her right hand and placed it in a small wooden box Robert had made for her. The box also held a tintype of Thomas, a letter he'd written her during their courtship, and a few other precious mementos. "I'm not forgetting you," she whispered to the photograph. "I'm not replacing you or pretending you never existed, but I'm choosing to live, Thomas. I'm choosing to love again. And I think, wherever you are, you'd understand that. You'd want me to be happy, want the children to have a father, want us to thrive instead of just survive." She closed the box gently and set it on a shelf where it would be safe but not hidden. Thomas had been real. Their love had been real, and that deserved acknowledgement even as she moved forward into a new life. The morning of the wedding, Mrs. Reynolds helped Victoria dress in a simple but beautiful blue dress they'd sewn together over the winter. It wasn't a traditional white wedding gown, which would have been inappropriate for a second marriage, but the deep blue fabric brought out Victoria's eyes and fit her perfectly. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Reynolds said, adjusting Victoria's hair. "Robert's going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." Victoria laughed nervously. "I'm getting married again. I can't quite believe it's happening." "Believe it, dear. And don't let anyone make you feel guilty about finding happiness again. You've earned this." At the church, Robert waited with barely contained impatience, dressed in a new suit that made him look handsome and slightly uncomfortable. But when Victoria walked down the aisle toward him, his face transformed with such obvious love and joy that she felt tears prick her eyes. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged vows written from the heart, promising to love and support each other through whatever trials came their way. And when the minister said Robert could kiss his bride, Robert took Victoria's face in his hands and kissed her with such tenderness that several ladies in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. But the moment that everyone would remember happened when the ceremony was officially over. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. Inside was a simple gold band, not as ornate as Thomas's ring had been, but beautiful in its clean simplicity. "I know you already wore Thomas's ring," Robert said softly, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "And I respect that history." This ring represents something different, not better or worse, just different. It represents the future we're building together, the new life we're choosing. He slipped the ring onto Victoria's left hand, onto the finger that had been bare since she'd moved Thomas's ring to her right hand months ago. Then he did something that made Victoria's heart overflow with love. He gently took Thomas's ring from the wooden box Martha held, and he placed it on Victoria's right hand, back on the fourth finger where she'd worn it before. "You love Thomas, and that love gave you two beautiful children," Robert said. "That's not something to hide or forget. It's something to honor. So you wear both rings, Victoria. His on your right hand for the past that shaped you, and mine on your left for the future we'll build together." Victoria looked down at her hands, at both rings gleaming in the church light, and burst into tears. But they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy and gratitude for a man who understood that love wasn't about erasing the past, but about honoring it while moving forward. "I love you," she said, throwing her arms around Robert's neck. "I love you so much." The reception at the ranch was lively and joyful, with food and music and dancing. Robert danced with Victoria, then with Martha, then with Mrs. Reynolds, then with Victoria again because he couldn't stay away from his wife for long. Samuel fell asleep in a pile of coats, exhausted from excitement, and Martha chattered nonstop about how she now had both a father in heaven and a father on earth. When the party finally wound down and guests began heading home, Robert carried sleeping Samuel to the cottage while Victoria held Martha's hand. They'd agreed to keep living in the foreman's cottage for now, at least until Robert could save enough to buy land of his own and build Victoria a proper house. Mrs. Reynolds had already promised that Victoria's job would remain available as long as she wanted it, adapting to her new circumstances as a wife. After the children were tucked into bed, Robert and Victoria finally had a moment alone. They stood in the small cottage that had become home, now theirs together instead of just Victoria's refuge, and looked at each other with the slightly awkward awareness of being newlyweds. "I know this isn't how most wedding nights go," Victoria said softly. "With children sleeping in the next room and living in a cottage that's not our own." Robert crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. "This is perfect," he said firmly. "We're together, the children are safe and happy, we've got a roof over our heads and food in the pantry. Everything else we'll build together, step by step." "What did I do to deserve you?" Victoria whispered against his chest. "You survived," Robert said simply. "You kept going when everything fell apart, you protected your children, you maintained your dignity through impossible circumstances. You deserved rescuing, Victoria. Everyone deserves to be rescued sometimes." She tilted her face up to kiss him, and he responded with the passion he'd been holding back during their courtship. They were married now, truly man and wife, and the future stretched out before them full of promise. Their first year of marriage passed in a blur of hard work and simple happiness. Robert continued working at the Reynolds Ranch while saving every penny he could toward buying his own land. Victoria managed the household with efficiency and grace, her wages adding to their savings. Martha and Samuel thrived with the stability of a two-parent home, calling Robert Papa Robert to distinguish him from their father in heaven. In August, Victoria realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with complicated emotions. She'd loved carrying Martha and Samuel, but those pregnancies had been with Thomas, and this one felt both exciting and slightly disloyal, even though she knew that was irrational. When she told Robert, he swept her into his arms and spun her around, his joy uncomplicated and pure. "We're having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Our baby." "You're not worried?" Victoria asked. About taking on another child, about the expense, about everything. I'm terrified, Robert admitted cheerfully, but the good kind of terrified. The kind that means something wonderful and scary and amazing is happening. We're building a family, Victoria. Our family. He was there for every step of the pregnancy, protective and attentive in a way that made Victoria fall in love with him all over again. He rubbed her swollen feet, brought her strange food combinations when cravings hit, and talked to her growing belly with such tenderness that it made her cry. Their son, whom they named Robert Thomas Garrison in honor of both his father and Victoria's first husband, was born in April of 1875, a healthy baby with his father's sage-colored eyes and his mother's dark hair. Robert wept when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed with the reality of being a father. "He's perfect," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're perfect. Our whole family is perfect." Martha and Samuel adored their baby brother, fighting over who got to hold him and help with his care. The cottage felt too small now for a family of 5, but Robert had good news on that front. "I've been talking to Mr. Reynolds," he told Victoria a week after little Robert was born. "He's selling me 20 acres on the eastern edge of his property, good land with water access and timber for building. I've got enough saved for the land and materials for a house. If I work on it during evenings and days off, we could move in by autumn." Victoria looked at him with shining eyes. "Our own land, our own house." "Your house," Robert said, taking her hand and kissing her palm. "Built exactly how you want it. You've lived in other people's houses long enough, making do with what was available. This one will be yours, built for our family on our own land." True to his word, Robert began building that summer. Ranch hands helped during their free time, raising walls and framing the roof. Victoria planned every detail, and Robert made her dreams real with skilled carpentry. The house wasn't grand, but it was solid and well built, with 3 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a porch where they could watch the sun set over the mountains. They moved in October, when the leaves were turning gold and the first frost painted the morning grass. The children ran through the empty rooms, their laughter echoing off bare walls while Victoria stood in the kitchen and cried happy tears. "What's wrong?" Robert asked, concerned, coming to wrap his arms around her from behind. "Nothing's wrong," Victoria said, leaning back against his chest. "Everything's right. 2 years ago, I was selling my wedding ring for bread, wondering how I'd survive the winter. Now I'm standing in my own kitchen in a house my husband built, with 3 healthy children and more happiness than I thought possible. It's overwhelming." Robert turned her to face him, wiping the tears from her cheeks. "You deserve all of this and more," he said firmly. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it." The years that followed were full and rich, marked by hard work and simple joys. Robert bought more land as their savings allowed, building a modest ranch that raised cattle and horses. Victoria continued helping Mrs. Reynolds part-time, the extra income helping them grow their property faster. Their family expanded with the birth of a daughter, Emma Victoria, in 1877, and another son, William, in 1879. Martha grew into a bright young woman who loved reading and teaching, eventually becoming a schoolteacher in Idaho City. Samuel proved to have his father's skill with horses and his stepfather's work ethic, becoming Robert's right hand on the ranch. Little Robert Thomas and his siblings grew up knowing they were loved, that their family was blended but complete, that having a father in heaven and a father on earth made them doubly blessed instead of lacking through it all. Victoria wore both rings. Thomas's ring on her right hand, honoring the love that had given her Martha and Samuel, and Robert's ring on her left hand, celebrating the love that had saved her and given her a future. People sometimes asked about the two rings, and Victoria always explained simply and without shame that she'd loved twice, lost once, and been blessed with a second chance at happiness. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Robert surprised Victoria with a trip to Idaho City, leaving the children with Mrs. Reynolds for the afternoon. They walked the main street together, hand in hand, and Robert led her to Thompson's General Store, which was still in business though Mr. Thompson had retired, and his son ran it now. "This is where it started," Robert said, standing on the boardwalk where he'd first approached Victoria with her heavy sack of groceries. "10 years ago, I watched you walk out of this store with your head held high despite having just sold your wedding ring. And I fell in love with your strength right then, even though I didn't fully realize it." Victoria smiled, remembering that desperate day that had led to everything good in her current life. "I was so lost back then, so scared and alone. But you kept going," Robert said. "You survived, and you let yourself be loved again, and you built this beautiful life with me. That took more courage than I think you realize." He pulled her close, right there on the public street in the middle of the afternoon, and kissed her with the same tenderness he'd shown on their wedding day. A few passers-by smiled and looked away, giving the married couple their moment. "Thank you," Victoria said when they finally pulled apart. "For buying my ring back, for believing I deserved more than desperation, for loving me and my children, for building a life with us, for being exactly the man I needed when I needed him most." "Thank you for letting me love you," Robert replied. "For trusting me with your heart after it had been broken, for making me a father, for building this ranch with me, for being my partner in everything. You saved me as much as I saved you, Victoria. We saved each other." They stood there together, two people who'd found each other in the hardest season of life and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. Around them, Idaho City bustled with afternoon activity, the town growing and changing as the territory moved toward eventual statehood. But for Robert and Victoria, the town would always be the place where their story began, where desperation met compassion, and where a simple act of kindness became the foundation for a lifetime of love. 25 years after they first met, Robert and Victoria Garrison sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. They were in their 50s now, their children grown and building lives of their own. Martha was married with 3 children, teaching school in Boise. Samuel ran a section of the ranch, his own growing family living in a house he'd built on Garrison land. Robert Thomas had become a lawyer, practicing in Idaho City. Emma taught music, and William was studying to be a veterinarian. Victoria's hair was threaded with silver now, and Robert's face showed the wear of years spent working in sun and wind. But their hands were still strong as they clasped together, and their love was deeper than ever, tempered by years of partnership and shared trials. "You ever regret it?" Victoria asked, not for the first time over the years. "Taking on a widow with 2 children and all the complications that came with me? Not for a single second," Robert said, also not for the first time. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Victoria. You and our children, our life together, all of it. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." Victoria looked down at her hands, at the 2 rings she still wore after all these years. Thomas's ring had worn thinner with time, and Robert's showed scratches and dents from decades of wear. But both still gleamed in the evening light, symbols of love that had shaped her into who she was. "I'm glad I sold my ring that day," she said softly. "I was desperate and scared, and it felt like losing the last piece of Thomas. But if I hadn't sold it, you wouldn't have bought it back." And if you hadn't bought it back, you wouldn't have had a reason to return it. And if you hadn't needed to return it, we might never have found our way to each other. Robert squeezed her hand. I think we would have found each other anyway. Some things are just meant to be. Maybe, Victoria agreed. But I'm glad it happened the way it did. Every struggle, every moment of desperation, every tear I cried led me here to this porch with you, and I wouldn't change any of it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside the house, Victoria had supper waiting, a pot of stew she'd made earlier. Tomorrow, Robert would ride out to check on the cattle in the north pasture. The day after that, they were expecting Emma and her new husband for Sunday dinner. Life continued in its comfortable rhythms, each day a gift they didn't take for granted. I love you, Robert said, as he did every night before they went inside. I love you too, Victoria replied, as she always did. And there on the porch of the house Robert had built with his own hands, on the land they'd carved out through hard work and determination. Two people who'd found each other in the depths of desperation held hands and counted their blessings. The widow who'd sold her wedding ring for bread had found not just survival but abundant life. The cowboy who'd bought it back had found not just a wife but a family and a purpose. And the ring that had started it all still rested on Victoria's right hand, a reminder that love never truly ends. It just transforms, making room for new love while honoring what came before. In the end, Victoria had learned the human heart was more expansive than she'd ever imagined, capable of holding multiple loves, multiple lives, multiple versions of happiness across a single lifetime. As the years continued to pass and their grandchildren began to arrive, Robert and Victoria became the patriarch and matriarch of a growing family. The ranch prospered, expanding across several hundred acres of Idaho territory. When Idaho achieved statehood in 1890, the Garrisons celebrated with a huge party that brought together family, friends, and neighbors from across the region. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered for a celebration that filled the ranch house to bursting. Robert Jr., now called RJ by everyone, stood to make a toast, his lawyer's voice carrying clearly through the crowded room. To our parents, he said, raising his glass. Two people who taught us that love can bloom even in the harshest conditions, that second chances are real, and that family is built on commitment and choice as much as blood. Mom, Dad, you've given us an example of what marriage should be. Thank you. The celebration continued late into the night, with music and dancing and stories shared across 3 generations. Victoria watched her family with a heart so full it ached, marveling at how her life had unfolded. From the desperate widow selling her wedding ring to this woman surrounded by abundance and love, the journey had been long and sometimes painful, but ultimately beautiful. Late in the evening, she found a quiet moment alone with Robert in the kitchen while the party continued in the main room. He was refilling the coffee pot, and she came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "Happy anniversary," she murmured. Robert set down the coffee pot and turned, gathering her into his arms. At 63 years old, he still made her heart flutter when he looked at her with that particular expression of adoration and desire. "Happy anniversary, my love," he said, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. 30 years married, and I still wake up grateful every morning that you said yes." "How could I say anything else?" Victoria asked. "You bought my wedding ring back and gave me hope when I had none. You loved my children as your own. You built me a house and a life and gave me more happiness than I dreamed possible." "We built it together," Robert corrected, as he always did. "I just provided some lumber and labor. You provided the heart that turned a house into a home." From the other room, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, their children talking, the sounds of family that had become the soundtrack of their lives. Victoria rested her head against Robert's chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, and thought about the long road that had brought them here. She thought about Thomas, gone now for over 30 years but never forgotten. She thought about the desperate day she'd sold her wedding ring, certain her life was over. She thought about the cowboy who'd appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't known how to pray, who'd seen past her desperation to the woman she could become with support and love. "What are you thinking about?" Robert asked, sensing her reflective mood. "How grateful I am," Victoria said simply. "For all of it. The hard parts and the good parts, the struggles that made us stronger, the joys that made it all worthwhile. I'm grateful for every single day we've had together." Robert held her tighter. "We've got plenty more days ahead of us," he said firmly. "I plan to love you for at least another 30 years. "At least," Victoria agreed, smiling against his shirt. They stood there in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built together, and let the love wash over them. Love that had started with a simple act of kindness, a ring bought back and returned, and had grown into something vast and enduring that would outlast them both in the family they'd created together. When they finally rejoined the party, their children looked at them with knowing smiles, recognizing the glow that still surrounded their parents even after 3 decades of marriage. It gave the younger generation hope, seeing proof that love could last, that choosing each other every day mattered, that building a life together was worth every sacrifice and struggle. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Victoria stood on the porch with Robert, waving goodbye to departing family members. Samuel helped load his sleepy children into his wagon. Emma gathered her music sheets. Martha collected her husband and teenage sons. The grandchildren called out cheerful goodnights, and gradually the ranch settled back into peaceful quiet. "Another successful party," Robert said, his arm around Victoria's shoulders as they watched the last wagon disappear down the road. "The best one yet," Victoria agreed. "Though I say that every year." "That's because they keep getting better," Robert pointed out. "More grandchildren, more love, more reasons to celebrate." They went inside to tackle the cleanup, working in the comfortable rhythm of 3 decades of partnership. Victoria washed dishes while Robert dried and put them away. They didn't talk much, didn't need to after so many years together. The silence between them was companionable and full of unspoken communication. When the kitchen was finally clean, they made their way to the bedroom they'd shared since the house was built. Victoria sat at her dressing table, unpinning her hair, and caught Robert's reflection in the mirror watching her with that same look of love he'd worn on their wedding day. "What?" she asked, smiling. "Just appreciating my beautiful wife," Robert said, coming to stand behind her. He took over the task of unpinning her hair, his fingers gentle against her scalp. "After 30 years, you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." "You need spectacles," Victoria teased, but she was blushing, pleased. "My vision's perfect," Robert assured her. "I see you exactly as you are. Strong, beautiful, kind, fierce when protecting what you love. You're everything I ever wanted and more than I deserved." Victoria turned on the bench to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. "We deserve each other," she said firmly. "We deserve this life we've built, this family we've raised, this love we've nurtured." "Stop acting like you got more out of this bargain than I did, Robert Garrison. We both won." He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, and they stood there swaying slightly, dancing to music only they could hear. Outside, the Idaho night was cool and clear, stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds. Inside, two people who'd found each other against all odds held each other close and counted their blessings. The years continued to pass, marked by new grandchildren, expanding business ventures, and the gradual slowing that came with age. Robert developed arthritis in his hands but refused to stop working until Victoria insisted he at least take help from their sons. Victoria's hair went completely silver, which Robert said made her look distinguished and beautiful in new ways. They faced sorrows too, as all long lives must. Mrs. Reynolds passed away in 1895, and her husband followed 6 months later. Victoria grieved for the woman who'd given her a chance when she desperately needed one, who'd supported her romance with Robert, who'd become a dear friend over decades. The Reynolds Ranch was sold to a company from back east, changing the character of the land they'd known so well. But the Garrison Ranch remained solid, run now primarily by Samuel, with help from his brothers and brothers-in-law. Robert officially retired at 70, spending his days maintaining the house, playing with great-grandchildren, and sitting on the porch with Victoria talking about everything and nothing. On a warm summer evening in 1903, 30 years after they'd first met and 28 years after their marriage, Robert and Victoria celebrated what would be their final anniversary together. They didn't know it would be their last, of course. Robert was 72, and Victoria was 66, both still healthy enough to enjoy life, and they planned for many more years together. The family gathered again, the celebration spanning 3 generations now. Victoria looked around at the faces of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, marveling at the legacy of love she and Robert had created. From her desperate sale of a wedding ring had come all of this abundance, all these people, all this joy. That night, after everyone had gone home, Victoria and Robert sat on their porch as they had countless nights before. The evening was perfect, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of hay and honeysuckle. Victoria rested her head on Robert's shoulder, his arm around her waist, and they watched the stars emerge. "I had a good life with you," Victoria said softly. "Had?" Robert questioned. "We're not done yet, woman. I've got plenty more years of annoying you ahead of me." Victoria laughed. "I meant I've had a good life so far, and I'm looking forward to more. Don't get your suspenders in a twist." "That's better," Robert said, kissing the top of her head. "I plan to love you until I'm 100 years old, maybe longer." "I'll hold you to that," Victoria said. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the night deepen around them. Neither of them knew that Robert's heart, worn out from 72 years of hard living and hard work, would give out peacefully in his sleep that very night. Neither knew that Victoria would wake to find him gone, would grieve hard but with the certainty that they'd had a beautiful life together, would live another 15 years surrounded by family before joining him in 1918. But in that perfect moment on the porch, they knew only love and contentment and gratitude. Two people who'd saved each other, who'd built a life from desperation and hope, who'd proven that second chances were real and love could bloom even in the harshest seasons. The 2 rings on Victoria's hands caught the starlight, both precious, both meaningful, both part of the story that had made her who she was. Thomas's ring for the love that had given her children and taught her what partnership meant. Robert's ring for the love that had saved her and shown her that hearts could heal and grow. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead, Victoria and Robert Garrison sat together on the porch of the home they'd built, surrounded by the land they'd tamed, blessed by the family they'd raised, and held each other close against the vast darkness of the universe. 2 souls who'd found each other and chosen love, again and again, every single day. The legacy they left behind wasn't measured in acres or cattle or money, though they'd been successful enough in all those things. It was measured in children who knew they were loved, in grandchildren who'd seen an example of what real commitment looked like, in great-grandchildren who would grow up hearing the story of how their great-grandfather bought back their great-grandmother's wedding ring and won her heart with kindness and patience and unwavering devotion. It was measured in a love story that started with desperation and ended with abundance, that proved second chances were real, that showed how the human heart could expand to hold multiple loves without diminishing any of them. Victoria had loved Thomas truly, and she'd loved Robert just as truly, and both loves had been real and valid and beautiful in their own ways. And somewhere in heaven, or wherever souls go when they leave this earth, Thomas Kingston looked down on the family his wife had built with Robert Garrison and smiled, grateful that his children had been raised by a good man, that his widow had found happiness again, that love had triumphed over loss. Because real love, the truest kind, wants happiness for the beloved even when it can no longer provide that happiness itself. The story of the widow who sold her wedding ring for bread and the cowboy who bought it back became legend in Idaho, passed down through generations of Garrisons and shared with new family members as they joined the clan through marriage. It became a touchstone, a reminder that kindness matters, that hope is real, that love can save us if we're brave enough to accept it. And long after Victoria and Robert were both gone, their descendants would gather on that same porch, in that same house Robert built with his own hands, and tell the story again. They'd talk about desperation and hope, about wedding rings and second chances, about a love that had started with a simple act of compassion and grown into something that would outlast them all. Because in the end, that's what love does. It expands and grows and creates and leaves the world better than it found it. And the love between Robert and Victoria Garrison had done exactly that, transforming two broken people into something whole, creating a family from fragments, building a legacy that would endure long after their mortal bodies returned to the Idaho soil they'd worked and loved. Their story ended as all stories must, with death and grief and the passing of an era. But it also never ended, living on in the hearts and minds of everyone they'd touched, every life they'd changed, every person who heard their tale and chose to believe in second chances and the redemptive power of love. And if you visit Idaho City today, you might find descendants of Robert and Victoria Garrison still working the land, still telling the story, still wearing the two rings that started it all, carefully preserved and passed down through the generations as a reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope can find us, love can save us, and tomorrow can be better than today if we're brave enough to keep going and wise enough to accept help when it's offered. The widow sold her wedding ring for bread, desperate and alone, and certain her story was over. The cowboy bought it back and returned it with his heart, offering not just a ring but a future, not just help but love, not just survival but the chance to truly live again. And together, they built something beautiful that would outlast them both, a legacy of love that proved, beyond any doubt, that second chances are real and worth fighting for, always and forever.